On a frozen morning in January 1942, a city of 3 million people survived on 125 grams of bread per day, bread bulked with sawdust, cellulose, and hope. The temperature fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Trams stood frozen in place. Streets were silent, not from peace, but from exhaustion. This was Leningrad. And the siege had only begun. For nearly 900 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad would be cut off from the world, surrounded by Nazi German and Finnish forces, bombarded from the air, and deliberately starved. More than 1 million civilians would die. And yet, the city would not surrender. This is not just a military story. It is a story of hunger as a weapon, of ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of endurance, and of a city that refused to disappear. In 1941, Leningrad was more than a city. It was a symbol. Formerly St. Petersburg, the birthplace of the Russian Revolution, Leningrad was the Soviet Union's second-largest city and a major industrial, cultural, and political center. It housed arms factories, shipyards, libraries, theaters, and museums filled with centuries of European art. To Adolf Hitler, Leningrad was not meant to be captured. It was meant to be erased. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the largest invasion in human history, 3 million Axis soldiers poured into the Soviet Union. One army group advanced north, its target, Leningrad. By late summer, German forces had pushed through the Baltic states. Finnish armies advanced from the north, reclaiming territory lost in the Winter War. Slowly, relentlessly, the ring tightened. On September 8, 1941, the last land route into Leningrad was cut. The siege had begun. Inside the city were nearly 3 million civilians, including over 400,000 children. There had been no full evacuation. Factories were still operating. Museums were still open. The population believed, hoped, the war would pass quickly. It would not. German strategy was clear. Rather than storm the city and suffer massive casualties, Hitler ordered Leningrad to be encircled and starved into submission. Food warehouses were bombed. Rail lines destroyed. Fuel supplies cut. The city was isolated, by design. As autumn turned to winter, food reserves collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Bread became the center of life. Ration cards were introduced. At first, workers received 500 grams per day. Then 400. Then 300. By November, the lowest ration, given to children and dependents, fell to 125 grams. That is less than a modern slice of bread. And even that bread was barely food. Flour shortages forced bakeries to add substitutes, bran, malt, sawdust, even powdered wallpaper paste made from cellulose. It filled the stomach, but not the body. People grew weak. Then they grew cold. Fuel ran out. Electricity failed. Water pipes froze. Residents chopped up furniture, books, and wooden picture frames to burn for heat. The city's famous libraries, once centers of learning, became silent witnesses to survival. Still, life did not entirely stop. Factories continued to produce weapons under bombardment. Radio broadcasts played classical music and news, not to entertain, but to remind citizens that the city was alive. Dmitri Shostakovich began composing his Seventh Symphony inside besieged Leningrad, a work that would become a symbol of defiance. Diaries were kept. Not grand reflections, just records of calories, temperatures, and loss. One entry reads simply. Genya died December 28 th. Grandma January 25 th. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. Winter had arrived. Hunger had become constant. And death was no longer shocking, it was routine. This was only the beginning. By December 1941, Leningrad was no longer fighting to live normally. It was fighting not to vanish. The sun rose late and weak, barely cutting through the gray sky. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Wind swept through shattered windows and unheated stairwells. The city froze, literally and metaphorically. This would become known as the Winter of Death. Food rations were slashed again. In December, the daily bread ration reached its lowest point of the entire siege. 125 grams for children and non-working adults. 250 grams for workers. 375 grams for soldiers at the front. There was no meat. No sugar. No fat. Bread was often the only food for days. People ate slowly, ceremonially, cutting the ration into tiny pieces to make it last. Crumbs were saved like treasure. Families debated whether to eat immediately or wait until morning, knowing hunger would wake them regardless. Soon, hunger stopped being pain. It became weakness. Then apathy. Then collapse. The city's infrastructure disintegrated. Electricity was available only a few hours a day, if at all. Water pipes froze, forcing people to collect snow or break ice from the Neva River. Elevators stopped. People lived on upper floors but no longer had the strength to climb back up. Many never returned to their apartments. Bodies appeared in stairwells. On sidewalks. In parks. At first, neighbors helped carry the dead. Then they dragged them on sleds. Then they stepped over them. The city's morgues overflowed. Graves could not be dug in frozen ground. Mass burials began. Death was everywhere, but still, the city endured. And yet, even in this darkness, the siege revealed something unexpected. People shared. Strangers divided bread. Factory workers gave up rations to children. Teachers continued classes in unheated rooms. Librarians protected manuscripts while barely able to stand. Acts of humanity flickered in a city running out of life. But desperation also crossed boundaries that no one spoke of openly. Cannibalism appeared. Soviet police records later confirmed hundreds, possibly thousands, of cases. Most involved corpses. Some did not. The authorities prosecuted these crimes harshly, not only to maintain order, but to preserve the idea that the city still had moral limits. The fact that Leningrad survived without descending into total chaos remains one of the most haunting aspects of the siege. While civilians struggled to survive, the city's defenders fought under impossible conditions. Soldiers manned anti-aircraft guns with frostbitten hands. Ammunition froze. Weapons jammed. The front line was only kilometers from residential neighborhoods. Shelling and air raids continued even as starvation killed far more than bombs ever would. The enemy believed the city would collapse on its own. They were wrong. Across Lake Ladoga, frozen solid by winter, Soviet planners saw a fragile hope. If trucks could cross the ice, supplies could reach the city. It was an insane gamble. The ice was thin. German aircraft patrolled the skies. Artillery fire cracked the surface. Entire convoys disappeared beneath the frozen lake. But in late November 1941, the first trucks crossed. They called it the Road of Life. The Road of Life did not end the starvation. It could not provide enough food to feed millions. But it did something just as important. It proved the city was not alone. Food trickled in. Evacuees, mostly children, were driven out under fire. Every crossing was a battle against ice, darkness, and death. Leningrad was still starving. People were still dying by the tens of thousands each month. But now, survival had a direction. The worst winter in the city's history was not over, but the city had passed a threshold. It had not surrendered. It had not fallen. And in the frozen silence, Leningrad made a promise, to itself, that it would endure whatever came next. By the spring of 1942, Leningrad was still alive, but barely. The snow melted, revealing what winter had hidden: mass graves, abandoned bodies, and streets lined with the remnants of a population that had been cut in half. More than 600,000 civilians were already dead. Most had not fallen to bombs or bullets, but to hunger. And yet, the siege did not end. It settled in. As warmer weather arrived, rations improved slightly. The road of life over Lake Ladoga now operated by boat instead of ice, bringing in grain, fuel, and ammunition. Bread rations increased just enough to keep many from immediate death. But starvation had already changed the city. Survivors were skeletal. Faces were hollow. People aged decades in months. Hunger altered behavior, memory, even language. Conversations revolved around food: what it used to taste like, how it was prepared, what it meant. Doctors documented a new condition they called nutritional dystrophy. Muscles wasted away. Organs failed. People stopped feeling cold, then stopped feeling anything at all. Many died quietly, lying down and never standing again. And still, the city functioned. Factories reopened using malnourished workers who could barely lift tools. Women and teenagers replaced men sent to the front. Artillery shells, tanks, and rifles continued to roll out of Leningrad's plants, even as workers collapsed beside machines. Culture, astonishingly, survived too. Libraries reopened. Newspapers printed daily editions, often reporting victories that felt distant from reality. Theaters performed to half-empty halls, where audience members sometimes lacked the strength to applaud. Then, in August 1942, the city did something unthinkable. It performed a symphony. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, written during the siege, was broadcast live across the city. Musicians were pulled from the front lines and hospitals. Some had to be fed extra rations just to stand and play. As the orchestra performed, Soviet artillery launched a massive barrage, not at the city, but outward, silencing German guns to ensure the music could be heard without interruption. Loudspeakers carried the symphony into the streets. German soldiers outside the city heard it too. The message was unmistakable. Leningrad was alive. While cultural defiance lifted spirits, the war ground on relentlessly. German forces continued shelling. Finnish troops maintained pressure from the north but stopped short of assaulting the city itself. The front lines froze into stalemate, with Leningrad trapped but not broken. For civilians, time blurred. Days were measured in rations. Weeks in funerals. Years in survival. Children grew up inside the siege, knowing nothing else. School lessons included air raid drills. Toys were made from scrap. Hunger shaped childhood memories. Yet even here, resistance took quiet forms. People planted gardens in courtyards and parks. They dried grass and weeds for soup. They repaired machines with scavenged parts. Every small act of normalcy was a refusal to disappear. By 1943, the tide of war began to shift. The German defeat at Stalingrad sent shockwaves across the Eastern Front. Soviet forces gained momentum. And in January, after multiple failed attempts, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra. The goal was simple, but vital. Break the siege. The operation succeeded, partially. A narrow land corridor was opened along the southern edge of Lake Ladoga. For the first time in nearly 500 days, Leningrad was no longer completely cut off. A railway was built under constant fire, restoring a lifeline to the city. Food supplies increased. Death rates fell sharply. But the siege was not over. German artillery still reached the city. Air raids continued. The enemy remained close enough to kill, but no longer close enough to starve the city into submission. Leningrad had survived the impossible. Now, it waited, for the final breaking of the ring. By the beginning of 1944, Leningrad had endured 872 days of isolation, bombardment, and starvation. The city was scarred, exhausted, and forever changed, but it was still standing. Now, the Red Army was coming. The strategic situation had transformed. Germany was retreating across the Eastern Front. Soviet forces had gained experience, confidence, and overwhelming manpower. Leningrad was no longer an isolated fortress, it was part of a larger counteroffensive pushing west. On January 14, 1944, the Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. Massive artillery barrages thundered across frozen ground. Tanks surged forward. Infantry followed through minefields and shattered villages. For the first time since 1941, the besiegers were on the defensive. German positions south of the city began to crumble. Supply lines snapped. Units that had held the ring for over 2 years were forced to retreat under relentless pressure. The siege, once thought unbreakable, was finally cracking. Inside Leningrad, civilians heard the difference immediately. The shelling changed tone, more outgoing fire, less incoming. Explosions moved farther away. For the first time in years, the city slept through nights without bombardment. People sensed it before they knew it. Something had changed. Factories increased output, no longer expecting destruction at any moment. Schools prepared for full schedules. Hospitals, still overwhelmed, began treating injuries that were not caused by hunger. Hope, long suppressed, began to return. The fighting was brutal. German forces fought stubbornly, retreating in stages and leaving behind scorched earth. Villages were destroyed. Roads were mined. Casualties mounted on both sides. But the momentum was irreversible. On January 27, 1944, Soviet authorities made the announcement. The siege of Leningrad was over. After 900 days, the blockade had been fully lifted. That night, the city erupted, not in chaos, but in light. A massive artillery salute lit the sky. Searchlights swept upward. Fireworks exploded above ruined rooftops. People wept openly in the streets, not just for survival, but for the dead who were no longer there to see it. The cost was staggering. More than 1 million civilians had perished. Entire families were gone. Neighborhoods were emptied. Mass graves surrounded the city. Few residents had escaped unmarked by loss. But Leningrad had not surrendered. It had not been taken. And in the logic of total war, that mattered. For the Soviet Union, the survival of Leningrad became a foundational legend, a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and resistance. The city was awarded the title, Hero City. Monuments were planned. Stories were recorded. The siege entered history not just as a military episode, but as a moral trial. Yet for those who lived through it, victory was complicated. Hunger did not disappear overnight. Trauma lingered. The silence left behind by the dead could not be filled by celebration. Survival itself carried weight. The guns had fallen silent. But the memory of the siege would never fade. When the siege ended, Leningrad did not return to life as it had been before. It learned how to live after. The city faced a quiet reckoning. Survivors returned to apartments that felt too large. Entire stairwells stood empty. Schools reopened with missing generations. At factories and offices, desks belonged to people who would never come back. Official records counted the dead in numbers. Survivors counted them by name. Mothers. Children. Neighbors. Friends. The physical rebuilding began quickly, bridges repaired, tram lines restored, factories modernized, but emotional reconstruction moved at a different pace. Hunger left long shadows. Many survivors suffered lifelong health problems caused by malnutrition, weakened hearts, fragile bones, shortened lifespans. And yet, life continued. Children were born. Weddings were held. Laughter returned, cautiously, as if afraid to be noticed. The Soviet state shaped the memory of the siege carefully. It emphasized heroism, unity, and resistance. Museums were built. Monuments erected. The siege was framed as a triumph of collective endurance over fascism. This was not false, but it was incomplete. For decades, the full human cost, the starvation, the cannibalism, the moments of moral collapse, remained largely unspoken in public. Diaries were archived. Personal stories stayed private. Memory became both shield and burden. Only later, as archives opened and survivors spoke more freely, did the full depth of the tragedy emerge. The most powerful legacy of the siege lies not in monuments, but in testimony. Diaries like that of Tanya Savicheva, whose simple notes recorded the deaths of her entire family, came to represent the siege more vividly than any statistic. She survived the blockade, but died shortly after, her body too damaged by starvation to recover. Her words endure because they are small. They do not describe battles or strategy. They describe absence. Today, the city is once again called St. Petersburg. Its canals are busy. Its palaces restored. Tourists walk streets where people once collapsed from hunger. Yet the siege is not forgotten. Each year on January 27th, the city pauses. Sirens sound. Flowers are laid. Names are read. Survivors, fewer with every passing year, stand as living bridges between past and present. The Siege of Leningrad remains one of the longest and deadliest in human history, not because of the armies involved, but because of the civilians who endured it. This story matters because it forces us to confront the limits of human endurance, and the choices people make when those limits are tested. Leningrad did not survive because its people were fearless. They survived because they had no alternative. They endured hunger, cold, and loss not for glory, but for tomorrow, because giving up meant extinction. The siege teaches us that history is not only shaped by generals and armies, but by ordinary people who wake up each day and choose, somehow, to continue. In the end, Leningrad did not just survive the siege. It remembered it. And in remembering, it gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have been lost to silence.